The day began without alarm clocks, without watches, without obligations marked on a calendar. For humans of the Paleolithic period, sunlight was the only guide. The cold of dawn was still present, but bodies were already moving. Those who lived near caves emerged in silence, observing their surroundings with attention. Others, sheltered in simple refuges made of branches, bones, or hides, rose from the packed earth and looked toward the horizon. Awakening wasn't a choice. It was instinct. Time was already running, and the day promised risks and tasks that couldn't be postponed. Survival began early, and it was the only job that existed. The first priority was fire. Keeping flames alive through the night was a collective effort, almost sacred. Without it, there was no warmth, no light, no protection against the predators of darkness. There was also no hot food, no emotional security. Rekindling fire wasn't simple. It required skill, patience, and the right resources. Dry wood, fine twigs, stones that produce sparks, or in later periods, rudimentary friction tools. That's why groups usually maintained embers under ash or used plant fibers to preserve heat from one day to the next. Archaeological records show that fire maintenance was a constant practice. More than technology, it was a life strategy. While some tended the flame, others organized themselves in silence. Collecting firewood was fundamental and required knowledge of the environment. Fallen trees, branches protected from moisture, flammable bark. Children observed or participated, learning from elders how to distinguish what was useful from what was worthless. By this time, another group was already departing in search of water. In many places, this meant walking miles to a river, spring, or even a clean puddle. Water was stored in improvised containers, animal bladders, dried gourds, or sewn hides. Pottery didn't exist yet. It would only emerge much later, but ingenious solutions already existed. Every object, even the simplest, was the result of centuries of trial and error. Before breakfast, which didn't exist, the group had already spent energy, planned their next hours, and evaluated nature's signs. Fresh tracks in the earth, wind carrying the scent of animals, ripe fruits on nearby trees, holes in the ground indicating edible tubers or roots. No movement was random. Everything was reading the sky, earth, vegetation, and even the behavior of companions. The landscape was a book that needed to be read every day with renewed attention. The popular image of cavemen using clubs and dragging women by their hair is far from reality. Paleolithic groups, despite facing constant dangers, didn't live in irrational chaos. There was organization, cooperation, and task division based more on experience and moment conditions than fixed rules. Men and women could hunt. Children observed, helped, learned. Decisions were made practically. Whoever was most prepared led. Whoever knew the terrain better guided. Whoever knew where to find honey or roots was heard. Knowledge was the true hierarchy. The routine changed according to climate and season. During harsh winters in cold regions, days began with reinforcing shelters, checking provisions, and desperately searching for warmth. In milder periods, gathering and hunting were more intense. In coastal regions, groups awakened with the tides and took advantage of the right moments to fish with rudimentary nets or stone traps. In dense forests, morning was utilized before heat and insects made walking impossible. In savannas, movements were more strategic, and animal observation was almost religious. This flexibility was vital. There was no typical day for a primitive human. There were patterns that repeated: lighting fire, seeking water, observing surroundings, organizing next actions. But everything depended on what nature allowed. If the previous night had been rainy, maybe there was no dry wood. If a predator had approached the camp, plans changed. If a child got sick, the priority was different. Nothing was certain except the urgency of life. Even so, there was space for pause and contemplation. Sometimes around the fire before departing, someone told stories, remembered past hunts, or taught how to tie a knot. These moments, though invisible in archaeological records, left traces in worn teeth from plant fibers, healed bones, objects carved with care. They show that humans, even when guided only by instinct, were already social, curious, skilled, and profoundly adaptable animals. This was just the beginning of the day, and it already said much about what made us human. The following hours revolved around what was most essential: obtaining food. Group members, now awake and organized, divided themselves. Some went alone, others in small pairs or larger formations, depending on terrain, season, and confidence in surroundings. Adult men usually handled the most dangerous hunts. Large prey required strength, cooperation, and much experience. But this wasn't a rigid rule. There's clear archaeological evidence that women also hunted, especially smaller animals, and knew how to handle tools and weapons with equal skill. The idea of absolute separation between hunters and gatherers doesn't hold up against what archaeology reveals. While some went hunting, others dedicated themselves to gathering. This activity, though often underestimated, was responsible for providing most calories in the Paleolithic diet: fruits, seeds, tubers, roots, leaves, eggs, and even insects. Everything nutritious was utilized. But this required deep landscape knowledge. It wasn't enough to recognize an edible plant. You needed to know when it was ready, how to avoid toxic parts, what time of year it flowered or fruited, and where in the valley it usually grew. This was ecological knowledge transmitted orally across generations with impressive precision. In the hottest moments, groups dispersed in tree shade, stone shelters, or under improvised structures. There, between pauses and conversations, they maintained and manufactured tools. One of the most common sounds of the Paleolithic world was the metallic echo of stone being chipped. With techniques developed over millennia, humans shaped pieces of flint, quartz, or obsidian to create sharp blades, scrapers, spear points, and other instruments. It was work requiring absolute tension. A single wrong movement could destroy an entire piece, but an experienced craftsman could produce a blade in minutes and knew exactly which type of stone to use for each function. As the day advanced, hunters might return or not. Hunting was always uncertain. Even with planning, tracking, and traps, success was never guaranteed. But when the return brought meat, the camp transformed. Animal food arrival was a collective event. Meat needed immediate treatment before heat spoiled it. It was cut with precision, divided into portions, smoked, or left drying in the sun. Bones were broken with stones to extract marrow, a rich fat source. Everything was utilized: hide, tendons, organs, teeth. There was no waste. From the gatherer's side, the return brought baskets or bags full of roots, fruits, and seeds. Many of these plants needed preparation. Hard shells removed, seeds crushed with stones, fibers separated. It was meticulous work, but essential. Some plants could be poisonous if eaten raw and required cooking or fermentation. Practical knowledge about this saved lives. There's evidence that even medicinal plants were already recognized and used, something suggested by residues found in fossilized teeth of Paleolithic individuals, containing compounds with healing properties. Food activity was accompanied by the constant need to repair or adapt their own instruments. Ropes braided from plant fibers, hand-woven baskets, clothes made with hides sewn with bone needles. Everything required maintenance. A tear in leather footwear, a spear with a loose point, a bag beginning to fall apart. These were small repairs that filled pause moments. Sometimes, right where they were, humans molded new utensils with branches, stones, or bone fragments. Improvisation was an essential skill. Nothing could be left for later. And when there was time, even if little, they created paintings on stones, marks on bones, patterns scratched in wood or wet clay. These records that today we recognize as prehistoric art may have been expressions of memory, identity, or even spirituality, but at the time they were just part of life, a natural reflection of those who observed the world and wanted to leave their mark. When the sun began disappearing on the horizon, Paleolithic humans returned to their shelter. But night wasn't just rest. It was also coexistence, sharing, and learning. Gathered around fire, always the center of collective life, they prepared what they had obtained throughout the day. Food division was more than practical necessity. It was the cement of social bonds. Eating together meant protecting the group, reinforcing alliances, and maintaining cohesion among all. While meat roasted on coals and fruits were organized, voices began filling the space. Stories were told by elders, transmitting knowledge, memories, and warnings. Without writing, oral tradition was the group's library, and children learned this way, hearing accounts that mixed hunts, dangers, animals, rules, and even explanations for natural phenomena. It was the beginning of tradition, culture, primitive pedagogy. Art was also part of these nights. In caves like Lascaux or Chauvet, there are handmarks, drawings of animals in movement, and still undeciphered symbols. In some of these places, bone flutes were found, suggesting music was already a present form of expression. Sounds, beats, and songs probably accompanied rituals, dances, or celebrations. Even without formal religion, there was a search for meaning and possibly a spiritual connection with the environment. Night also required care. Small children, sick, or elderly needed special attention. Found bones show that people with fractures or disabilities lived for years, indicating active community support. There was no room for abandonment. Each life counted not just as workforce, but as an essential part of the collective. Inside shelter, space was organized. Near the fire, the day's tools collected food, clothes, and hides, drying. Around rest zones and waste deposits, This shows that even without walls or rooms, groups structured their space with logic and care. Maintaining order was also a form of protection. Knowledge transmission was constant. How to sharpen a blade, how to braid a rope, how to recognize a poisonous plant. Everything was taught through observation and repetition. There was no separation between childhood and adult life. Learning was part of routine. From early on, each individual was trained to become autonomous and useful to the group. Despite the image of isolation, Paleolithic groups connected. Materials from distant regions, like seashells found far from coasts, indicate trade networks. This suggests encounters between groups, shared rituals, and a social world much broader than imagined. Living as a Paleolithic human required multiple skills: hunting, gathering, manufacturing, caring, planning, and adapting. They dealt with the environment in an integrated way, without wasting resources and respecting nature's rhythms. And all this without modern tools, without metal, without agriculture. More than brutes, they were strategists, and survived longer than any civilization that came after. Before continuing, it's worth remembering that this channel is a new project, totally dedicated to exploring our ancestors' lives without romanticization, without exaggeration. Just facts, curiosities, and the fascinating daily life of the primitive world. If you're enjoying this content and want to learn more about how the first humans really lived, subscribe to the channel now. This helps a lot to continue bringing this type of material with depth and respect for history. If this dive into our ancestors' daily life sparked your curiosity, subscribe to the channel. Here we'll continue exploring primitive life as it really was, based on evidence in a clear and engaging way. Leave your like, share with those who are also interested in history, and see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, and see you later.